All right, good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Please keep eating if you're still going with your main course. I'm about to invite our special guest up in just a moment. But before I do that, Miner's Promise, which I'm sure many of you will have heard about in meetings prior. Miner's Promise is pleased to announce the Gift launch event that'll be opened with an address by Miner's Promise co-patron, the Honourable Madeleine King, Minister for Resources in Northern Australia, and that will conclude with some insights from Sally North, the WorkSafe Commissioner at WorkSafe WA. The Gift is a live interactive play exploring one of the most difficult safety and culture aspects in mining, energy and resources. Through varied encounters with three characters played by outstanding actors, we get to experience their journey from a tragic event on site through the response, recovery and then the healing process. It's a compelling story of compassion and resilience and hope. WA Mining Club members can get their hands on tickets using the QR code up on the screen there, and all proceeds from the $20 ticket sales will go towards Miner's Promise to run their Standing Together family support group, which is a really important part of their support for families following mining tragedies. And as we were tragically reminded last week, our industry needs Miner's Promise, and your support of this event will help them to go on providing the best possible care that they can in the toughest of times. So that's the details there. If you want any more info, hit that QR code on screen. Before I invite our guest speaker up to the stage, just a reminder, we are using Slido again this afternoon, so time permitting, we'll get to some of your questions towards the end of our chat. That QR code there will take you straight into the session for this afternoon. You can also enter in a code 25AUG as you see it there on the screen. All right, to our guests. Bronwyn, it's quite a long intro, so take your time wandering up to the stage. Bronwyn Barnes, a distinguished leader in the global resources industry with nearly 30 years of experience across exploration and mining. She's worked extensively in Africa, especially West Africa, and held senior positions at BHP, Fortescue and Western Mining. As President and CEO of Ivanhoe Atlantic since 2022, she leads projects under Robert Friedland's Ivanhoe Group, including Ivanhoe Liberia. Bronwyn chairs ASX-listed Indiana Resources and Finder Energy while maintaining close ties with investment agencies and governments to support infrastructure development. Her diverse board experience spans sectors including fishing, education, Indigenous affairs and community development. She served as Managing Director, Chair and shareholder across multiple ASX entities. In 2019, Bronwyn was inducted into the WA Women's Hall of Fame, recognising her outstanding leadership and business impacts. With deep governance expertise and a passion for sustainable growth, Bronwyn continues to influence the global mining sector through strategic development and transformative partnerships. And that's it. Would you please welcome Bronwyn Barnes? I have a list of questions written down on some pieces of paper, and they've vanished in the last hour or so. But I think I remember. We're going to start anyway. You're going to tell us all about Ivanhoe Atlantic. What do people who might not be familiar with the Ivanhoe Atlantic story in the room, what do they need to know about Ivanhoe Atlantic?
Ivanhoe Atlantic is the owner of the Conquini iron ore project in Guinea. And some of you might remember the Conquini iron ore project used to be called the Nimba iron ore project, and it used to be owned by BHP Billiton many, many, many years ago. And I'm just doing the clicker, and are we clicking? No, we're not clicking. Can we have the first slide? Someone's running around.
There we go.
There we go. Oh, hang on. There we go. So look, Robert Friedland, some of you may recall, purchased the Nimba Iron Ore project from BHP in 2019. Purchased it for $1 with an undertaking to keep all of the local staff employed whilst a development pathway for the project was put into place, and also we assumed all of the historic liabilities and the royalties that were due to both BHP and Newmont, who had been historical owners of the project. So look, it's an incredibly high-grade asset. We are about 160 kilometres south of the Simandou Iron Ore project, so we are in the general neck of the woods of Simandou. However, we are, quite different from the Simandou project in that we are not exporting or proposing to export through Guinea. We have an agreement with both Guinea and Liberia to export through Liberia using existing infrastructure. So we're about 40 kilometres from the existing railway that sits in Liberia. We'll be coming out through that railway and then through the port of Buchanan. It's a really nice deposit. It's 750 million tonnes of high-grade iron ore, running at about 66%. We're starting with a 209 million tonne, piece of dirt that's 67.5% iron ore. So this is beautiful, beautiful iron ore. Key permits and everything's in place. There's a granted mining convention with the government of Guinea. Obviously, I've just finished signing the rail and port access agreement with the government of Liberia. So we signed that in July. And we're just moving through ratification now with the government of Liberia, so that will be done in Q4. And I guess the really interesting thing about Ivanhoe Atlantic is we are a private company. We are an American company as well, so we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between being an American and an Australian company a little bit later. So look, that map there just gives you a mud map of where we're located. And it's still not clicking. Can I have the next slide, please? And that's the iron ore. So I just love this photo. And it's also Robert Friedland's favourite photo. He looks at this photo and he says to me, Bronwyn, that is a mountain of money. And I say, yes, Robert, yes, that's exactly what it is. And you can see, have a look at that overburden. It's like this much. Delicious.
I don't think I've ever heard iron ore deposits described in the way that you're describing them this afternoon. Beautiful and delicious.
Oh, well, you know, that's the difference that having a female brings. So look, I've been there for just on 3 years. This has been a really interesting transition project for me. You know, it had been a project that, you know, the Friedland Group had purchased it in 2019. The mining convention was transferred from BHP Newmont to the the Ivanhoe subsidiary in 2020. Then COVID hit. Then the project kind of went dormant for a while, and they had some management changes. And then I got a phone call from Robert, or actually from Robert's PA, asking, "Do you know?" My name's Maria, I'm calling from Mr. Robert Friedland's office, do you know who that is? And it's like, I know exactly who that is. I'd always followed Robert's career. Obviously, when I was working with Andrew Forrest at Anaconda, Robert was doing Voisey's Bay. And so we had the two nickel, and so I was always very aware of Robert, always sat front row whenever he did a speech at any of the mining conferences. Kirsty's nodding. She was with me at the conference where he spoke at Diggers, and I was like, we have to be there early, we've got to get a seat, I have to see Robert Friedland speak. So yeah, when he rang up and said, can you fly to London, I want to talk to you about coming to work for me, I was like, no worries,
no
I was
brainer.
there. Yeah.
Yep.
So. Can we have the next slide, please? I just want to talk a little bit more about the project before we finish up. So look, this is the infrastructure that's in place that we got for our dollar. So there's a camp of around 200 people. All the infrastructure is in situ for the mine site, so all the roads are there. Water filtration systems, environmental studies are all done. We currently have around 160, 170 people on site, so we've retained a lot of people. We have an office in Conakry for the Guinea side. We've got an office in Liberia, in Monrovia for the Liberian side. We've got an office in London where corporate sort of HQ sits. And of course, we've got an office in Perth that's been getting us ready for the ASX listing, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. And if we could have the next slide, please. This is to prove that there's actually really a railway there. So a lot of people forget that, West Africa has had a strong history of mining. And, this is the old, what they call the LAMCO. So this was the Liberian American Iron Ore Company that, developed the old Yekapa project probably about 40 years ago now. And when they exited, they left the railway behind. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So look, we drive up to the project through on the Liberia side, so you fly into Monrovia, and it's about an 8-hour drive from the airport up into the Guinea side. This is the existing railway being used by ArcelorMittal, so that's the current operator of the railway line through an agreement with the government of Liberia. So I don't stand around taking photographs of AML trains generally, so it's not a hugely good copy photograph, but it gives you an idea that trains do run on that railway line. And the next photograph, please. Well, while we're waiting. And this is the Port of Buchanan. So this is where ArcelorMittal are already exporting through the Port of Buchanan, and will be proposing to export through this port also. And of course, that's in the Rail and Port Access Agreement we've just finished, and we've been given a land allocation down at the port where we'll have our own ship loading facilities down at the port. So that's the run through with what have I been doing for the past 3 years?
Well, exactly. Now we can see you've been busy, being the official photographer for
exactly.
Ivanhoe Atlantic. I was going to leave this question for later, but the so-called Liberty Corridor that's been a bit in the news of late, and speculation around problems there, even the suspension of the project, which is a $5 billion project. Is that what we're looking at here? Is
no,
that
are you thinking? You're not getting confused with the Simandou line?
Well, that's the one coming from Guinea down through Liberia, right?
No, the Simandou line goes from the Simandou project down to Morebaya, or across to Morebaya, which is the port in Guinea. No, so that's not me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That's the Rio winning consortium thing.
Right. So you wouldn't be using that? I'm
not using that.
Okay. Good to know. So much to your backstory. I sort of touched on, some of the highlights in your introduction there. I have to borrow one of Rob Humphreyson's lines again. You've been on more boards than Mick Fanning.
Yep.
There you go, Rob. There you go. So many different senior and executive positions that you've held as well. But let's go right back to the early days.
Early days.
A young Bronwyn Barnes, fresh out of university.
I know.
In hand, an arts degree, majoring in French and medieval literature. What exactly was your plan with that?
Well, I don't know, because under the other arm I had a 1-month-old baby.
More pressing matters.
Yeah, no, look, I think, when I finished school, and shout out to St Mary's. I know that the girls are all down the back there with the headmistress Judith, so I've had a long association with St Mary's. I did get a Rotary Exchange scholarship to Belgium for a year. I had done French all through school, and I really loved French. And so off I toddled to Belgium for a year. Before I left, I was offered a place at Curtin University in business. And then when I came back, it was, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go into the business world. I wanted to continue with my French. And I loved history. And look, I had no idea what I was going to do with it. I had this vague idea that, I would be translating medieval manuscripts at the Sorbonne and, have some incredibly glamorous lifestyle in Paris. And here I am on the railway line in Liberia, so it might work out so well. But look, it was, I guess, it comes back to the premise of if you do what you love. And I just really loved that. So look, I just, I started finished that degree, had a young child. My husband and I then moved to Karratha and spent, he was working on Woodside Phase 1 and then Phase 2. And then we travelled around for a few years, went down to Geraldton where he was working on a mineral sands construction project there. And then eventually got back to Perth and did a grad dip of business because I thought I better get a job.
Yeah.
And so my first job was as an interpreter translator for a research and development company that had a joint venture with Renault.
Yeah.
And so
where the French would have come in handy.
where the French was very, very handy.
Yeah. And continued to serve you well.
Well, and this is, you know, the interesting story. Like, when I left BHP, I really wanted to work in West Africa. And there were, I kept applying for roles with companies, big sort of companies, West Australian-based companies that were advertising for roles in West Africa. And every time I applied, I was told that they weren't taking women, that it was too dangerous for a woman, and those roles would only be offered to men. So I didn't even get the interview. That was when I thought, oh, it's too dangerous. So I went off to Cuba, Guatemala, Panama instead. and that's when, you know, I was sort of doing my own projects. But ended up in West Africa because that's really where I wanted to be. Yeah. I wanted to speak French and I wanted to do interesting things.
Yeah. You mentioned before about working with Twiggy.
Yeah.
Of course, this is perhaps not the Twiggy we know at the moment, but Twiggy of years gone by, Anaconda time in his life. Tell me about the moment that he got in touch.
That was when I was still in the R&D sector, and I really wanted to work in the mining sector. Which was a little hard for a French medieval historian. You're not really going to get many job offers. And so I'd been quite successful in the R&D sector, and I became one of the top government grant getters for R&D funding out of the federal government. And so I'd come across Twiggy's path, and somebody else had recommended me in, and got the phone call, would I go and run government lobbying for Andrew? So I was at home on maternity leave with my second child, and she was only probably about 6 or 7 weeks old, I think. And so I ended up cutting a deal with Andrew that I would work for him 2 days a week, 1 day in the office and 1 day a week from home, running a federal government lobbying campaign for Anaconda Nickel for a multi-user infrastructure corridor connecting the northern, goldfields, so what would have been the new Mount Margaret project at Anaconda across to the port of Geraldton.
Yeah.
So that was when I sort of first got into multi-user infrastructure and working with governments about how do you deliver road, rail, port, water, energy to support mining projects.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And then from one billionaire in Twiggy to another, quite different but no less intriguing, in Robert Friedland. I had to do a bit of a deep dive on Robert Friedland, and I almost had to read it twice because it's such a fascinating story. But the child of Holocaust survivors, I think his father spent 3 years at Auschwitz.
Yep.
Robert spent time in prison for possession of a not insubstantial quantity of LSD. He got to know Steve Jobs in college. They went to uni together, and I think Robert was working his uncle's apple orchard in Oregon and invited Steve Jobs to work there on the weekends, and that's supposedly where the brand Apple has its origin. So
correct.
And it goes on, never mind his mining endeavours.
Yeah.
Fascinating character.
Oh, he's amazing.
Yeah. What's he like to work for?
Fantastic.
Yeah?
Well, with all the idiosyncrasies of a billionaire.
Yeah.
I mean, these are tricky people to work for. Both Andrew and Robert have their own, particular operating styles. But in the early days, Andrew was fantastic to me. And, I learnt so many lessons from him at Anaconda that have stood me in amazing stead for the rest of my career.
Yeah.
And let's remember, when Andrew did Anaconda, he was, 35, 36 years old. Like, that's just outrageous when you think about it today, to have built that kind of a company at that time. And I'd just turned 30, so we were all in this magnificent sort of company that was building something that was just completely brand new. Unfortunately, it didn't work out so well in the end. But look, we had a go.
Yeah.
You know, what have I learnt from Robert? I mean, you know, I remember very early on, you know, when I first came into this project, you know, this project had lots and lots of problems with it, and about how to move it forward, how to get through some government issues we had going on, some community issues, environmental issues. Like every time I went to the office and opened another email, I'd have another problem to fix. And I sort of started going and seeing Robert and just sitting with him and saying, you know, I think we should do this and I think we should do that. And he's so good. You know, he sits there and he listens and he listens. And then, you know, one day he looked at me and he just sort of said to me, you know what, Bron? He said, I need you to think bigger. He said, you're not in Perth anymore. He said, I need you to think really big about how to solve these problems. And that's when I came up with the Liberty Corridor.
Right. Fantastic.
Yeah.
You've said previously that being in a role like you have at the moment requires you to be something of an expert in global geopolitics, and I think that's been proven true, certainly in recent issues that you've had to resolve, particularly, you know, in Africa. What exactly do you mean by that? How important is it? And I suppose looking at Australia's position now on the world stage, now with AUKUS in play, and critical mineral strategies, all of that sort of thing. Why is geopolitics now absolutely at the forefront of what you do?
So look, I think as an American company, this is where we are a little bit different. But I certainly think that there's a lesson here that Australian companies can learn from it. And I'm very clear with this with my team, who are here today, and they hear me say it all the time, is, you know, we're not here playing mining. We don't play mining anymore, we're playing geopolitics. And, you know, we are moving in this world now where we can see that critical minerals and these tier one assets that are so incredibly important, in that they're developed properly, you know, in terms of environmental and social impact, that they have the right funding partners, that the materials are going to the right offtake partners. You know, this is another whole level of critical thinking that I don't think historically as mining companies that we've had to do. So we don't play mining, we're playing geopolitics. So what does that mean for us? Look, I'm really interested in assets beyond Conquini, so assets that sit on the critical mineral supply list for the US, in jurisdictions that are allied to the US. So look, I think a lot of people aren't sort of registering this because of our lack of connection to the US and to DC. But over the past 2 years, I've spent as much time in Washington as I have in Africa. So this is how important Washington is to us.
Who are you speaking to there?
Look, it's a broad variety of people, but it's mainly State Department. Obviously, it's people like, you know, IFC, DFC, USTDA. These are all organisations that have the US government as their major funding partner or major shareholder. And the questions that get asked consistently in Washington is, do you have any Chinese shareholders? If you've got Chinese shareholders, out.
Really?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. Do not want to see Chinese shareholders. Where's your offtake going?
Even on a minor level?
No, don't like it.
Yeah, right.
Like, this is really, you can quantify this, you know, and I think as Australians, you know, people kind of look at what's happening in Washington and think, oh, this is just crazy, crazy town and it'll all be over soon. And no, I don't think it will. I think this is going to last for 10 to 12 years.
Is this a Trump thing, or is it also predate Trump 2.0 and the end of the Biden stage?
You know, to a certain extent, I think Trump is probably the mouthpiece for it. I certainly think that what you're seeing is a realisation by the Department of Defence in Washington that they no longer control their critical mineral supply chain, and that, you know, the majority of products that they need for their defence force are supplied by China. So what happens if you go to war with China? It's out.
It's maybe a topic for another day, isn't it?
Well, no, and I think as Australia we need to be thinking about this.
So how important then is, you know, AUKUS as an arrangement? And how well do you think Australia is playing the AUKUS card at the moment?
Look, I don't think as Australia, we've quite understood the level of seriousness in Washington about securing the critical mineral supply chain in the US. I think what's really important to them now is, they want to see onshore processing in the US. So that's great that we can talk about we've got rare earths deposits here and, that kind of thing, and we might do some processing here. That's fine. What they're really interested in is where is the finished product going to be made. So the US agenda is all about jobs in America, and they want to secure this supply chain in America. So look, we're very cognizant of that mood and that focus. And I was, in DC in July with Robert, and we met the Deputy Secretary of State, Chris Landau, to talk about our project and about the Liberty Corridor and about US participation in the construction of the Liberty Corridor. And really that's about the US accessing high-grade iron ore that can be used for defence purposes. Yeah. So, the majority of the iron ore sector in the US is based on scrap. You can't build steel battleships out of steel made of scrap. Yeah. You have to have high-grade iron ore. So look, our product, we don't have Chinese shareholders. We won't have Chinese offtake partners. This product will be either going to the Middle East, Europe, or to the US. And it will ultimately be feeding into the US supply chain. Yeah.
Being an American-based company as opposed to Australia, but working so extensively in parts of Africa, can you tell us about the differences that you've experienced in trying to work up a project in Africa as opposed to somewhere like Australia?
Well, it's been a while since I've done a project in Australia. Look, I think, but this has been very focused for me around my career, is that, when I sort of finished up with BHP, I was very clear I wanted to work offshore. And I wanted to do early country entry for new projects. So, we did those projects in Cuba. I did a nickel project in Guatemala that we got up and privately, and we sold it onto a Greek nickel smelter, which was, a great little deal. And then, went to Guinea, was deputy CEO for a bauxite development in Guinea, and I've done all sorts of things. Obviously, the Tanzania story. We did copper in Botswana with Mod Resources. There's all sorts of things. But look, I think, what was I really interested in that early country entry piece is I like doing this licence to operate stuff. I like getting in early, just after discoveries are made, and working through that process to pull together the financing with your government approvals, with your stakeholder engagement piece, because all of those things have to work together. It's not just a great drill hole that makes a mine. There's all these other things that you have to bring. I think what's concerning me about Australia is that we've overcomplicated it. And I think that the levels of approvals and processing that we have to go through in Australia now are too onerous. And we're going to miss windows of opportunity. There are other countries that have got more streamlined processes to do this. And we have to realise this is a competition. We've got to stop treating this like it's just for creating value for shareholders. Yes, that's important, but I think this is bigger than that now. I think this is about, it's a competition between countries about who gets the market.
If you had to compare the sovereign risk of operating in Africa against the bureaucratic challenges here in Australia, what's the bigger hurdle to overcome if you try to get a new project off the ground? Hard to compare.
Yeah, look, it's hard to compare because they're so different and they're different drivers.
Yep.
So developing nations want to see investment, they want to see employment, they're very keen to support you to be successful. And I think my takeaway from Australia is, we're more focused here about making sure you don't do the wrong thing. Well, I'd have to argue, when was the last time somebody really did the wrong thing, as you know, in the mining sector? Like, we're also focused here on developing these assets, you know, responsibly, you know, in partnership with government and community and for the benefit of shareholders. Like, I think we need to be given some credit for the work that we have done over the past 20 years.
For those in the room who are not familiar with your Tanzanian adventures, I mean, it's kind of resolved now, isn't it? And, you know,
well, no, it's not. It's not going.
You're in a winning position at the moment.
Yes,
though,
yes.
Fair to say.
Yes.
But it's been a long slog. Give us the short version of how that came about and where you're at now.
Oh, look, that was one of those moments. So look, April must have been 2017. A friend of mine asked me to come onto the board of Indiana as the chair to help them out with some shareholder disputes, you know, So it was fine, no worries, I'll give you a hand. And I'd only been on the board for 6 weeks and the Tanzanian government changed the mining code and removed the asset. And so, you know, I dragged money into the company, taken a very high profile position, and as chair, you just can't walk away. You know, like, what do you say? Oh, thanks, you know, I'm only here for the good times, I'm not here for the bad times. So look, we did 2 years of negotiation with Tanzania to try and get the asset back, and that was unsuccessful. Of course, you know, I was in Tanzania in 2019, the 9th of December 2019, I sat with the Mines Minister of Tanzania in Dar es Salaam, and he assured me that I would be very satisfied with how this would all be resolved and that I would have the licence back. And 11 days later, it was advertised on their website, on the mining website, for sale.
Wow.
So it was like... So
that was his version of a resolution that you were satisfied with.
Yeah, and I was going to bid for it again.
Yeah.
It's like, no, mate, I've already spent $60 million on it. I'm not going to be bidding for it. So look, that's when we started arbitration through the International Centre of Settlement Investment Disputes through Washington. And as part of that, you know, I ended up as executive chair and major shareholder of Indiana.
Yep.
So look, fast forward 7 years later. We did a settlement agreement with Tanzania. I did recover $90 million from Tanzania. I have paid out the majority of that to shareholders now, so $64 million Aussie has been given back to shareholders of Indiana. 37 million still sits in Treasury at Indiana, and we're using that for our projects in South Australia. But, you know, Tanzania breached its own settlement agreement. So I'm taking them back to arbitration in London.
So you're still going?
Yeah, I'll go them again.
You're getting all of it. You're getting all of it. I mean, there is a risk. I mean, you know, we've seen obviously Resolute Mining. I have a story to tell about that, and West African Resources just today.
I know.
It is a different playing field there, isn't it? What gives you the confidence, Bronwyn, to just go in there and dig in and fight where others perhaps wouldn't?
Look, I think when I first started the fight against Tanzania, if I had $1 for everybody who told me I was wasting my time, I would never be successful, and even if I was, I would never get any money out of Tanzania, I'd be as rich as Robert Friedland. Like, there was not one person who told me that I would be successful. But look, I'd done the DD, I'd spoken with the lawyers, I looked at historic cases, I saw how other companies had recovered their money. I was confident in the strength of my case because I'd done the 2 years of negotiation with Tanzania, and I just knew that I would win. And so, you know, that sustained me for 5 years of arbitration and every naysayer here in Perth. And I think, you know, I was only talking to one of the guys at Euros. I don't even know, was Ben crossing here? Oh, there he is. And Ben, it was you that said to me the other day, you know, 5 years fighting Tanzania, everybody said you were mad, and now you're the poster child for suing an African government. It's like, oh, fancy that. So no, look, I think, you know, once again, the settlement agreement with Tanzania was very clear. They couldn't levy any taxes on the settlement amount that they were paying me. They paid $90 million and then sent me a tax bill. I mean, come on, guys. You know, this isn't rocket science. You know, lawyers both sides. You can't breach your own settlement agreement.
No, It's as simple as that, isn't it?
It's as simple as that. So let's have another go.
Keen to get your thoughts on the Simandou region.
Yeah.
It's obviously been dubbed the Pilbara killer. That phrase has really caught on here. But should we be worried about that? Is it as big a threat as the names might suggest?
Look, I don't really think so. I certainly don't see it as the Pilbara killer. I think that, Rio's, and, obviously I'm not Rio and I can only go on what the market is informed of by Rio, where, their plan is to obviously blend Simandou product with the lower grade ore from the Pilbara. But, once again, this is a product that's very focused on the China market. Look, I think, look at the investment that's already been made in the Pilbara in terms of infrastructure. Your production costs in the Pilbara are still, some of the lowest production costs in the world. So I don't see it as being the end or the death knell of the Pilbara anytime soon. Our production, we're only going to start at 2 to 5 million tonnes. It'll take us a couple of years to ramp up to 30 million tonnes. That's really nothing in terms of the world stage. The biggest constraint that, the African sort of countries have still is infrastructure and getting their product to market. And this infrastructure takes a long time to develop in Africa. It's not quick.
Yeah.
So everybody should be right. The
little
jet
sigh of
ski
relief
market
then.
should, hold strong for a few more years.
Your career, as you sort of alluded to already,
Yeah.
I mean, there seems to be this series of big moments throughout your career where you had a choice to step up and do something bold and brave, or perhaps just retreat and stay more in your comfort zone. But you've always taken that opportunity, haven't you? Always said yes, done something different, done something big, gone overseas, ventured into Africa. Things that might have been too daunting to others in your position. Where does that sense of belief and courage come from?
We have to build it.
Yeah.
And, you don't start like this, didn't wake up like this. And I think, very early on at Anaconda, I used to go to meetings and I'd sit there very quietly and I would never say anything. And, Twiggy sort of pulled me aside one day after a meeting and he said, that's enough. Like, if you're going to come to these meetings as a senior executive, you need to open your mouth and you need to talk. And I was absolutely petrified. How do you build up the confidence to walk? And these are men, rooms full of men when there was no, women in mining, really. Like, you'd be the lone female in the room, which is not unlike negotiating with Tanzania. In the final days, that negotiation, 15 Tanzanian lawyers from the Solicitor General's department and me and my lawyer from London, it's just like, once again. So look, I do talk about things like building your brave, and I realised early on in the Anaconda days that I needed to get brave really quick. So how did I take fear out of me? Because most people make their decisions based on fear rather than, a position of confidence. So I did really, I set myself all these challenges. I was afraid of heights, so I learnt how to, I went and did abseiling courses. I was afraid of, open water and sharks, so I did 5 Roto swims, became an open water swimmer. Did my master's certificate in diving, so it was this constant, pushing myself.
Met them head on.
Yeah, push. And I think, you're just always saying, I do have this fundamental belief, I always say yes. It's the only answer.
Yeah.
If you ask me anything, the answer's yes.
Yeah. You mentioned the gender imbalances that you've come across over the years. From when you started up till now, are you satisfied with the rate of change in the industry? Incredibly disappointed.
Incredibly disappointed.
Yeah.
Yeah. To think that, I've been at this for 30 years, and okay, that's great, that we're seeing a lot more women in the room now. In fact, we were just having a conversation with Kirsty, who's, been a mate for 20 odd years. Years ago we came to a mining club luncheon as a group of girls and they didn't know what to do with us, and we got sat on the back table by the toilets. all the women all together on one table, so we didn't annoy any of the men in the room. So look,
how dare you even think to do that?
I know.
Kirsty's been annoying people in the room ever since.
Yeah. Well, and that's why
I say that with great affection. Don't worry, we go.
So look, where am I disappointed? I thought that we would see many more women in true operational leadership roles.
Yeah.
I'm still underwhelmed by the number of women in operational leadership roles. And the piece that I always bang on about that really annoys me is, where are the women on the top 20 shareholder lists of ASX listed companies? You can count them.
Zippo.
Well, I'm on a couple.
Yep.
I'm a major shareholder of a couple of companies. But, he who has the gold makes the rules. Mm. Get the gold, girls. Work out how you're going to get onto those top shareholder lists.
Yep. We are rapidly running out of time, and I'm keen to get to a couple of questions from the floor, but I'm under strict instruction to also ask you about your racing insights. Of the many boards that Bronwyn has been on, Perth Racing is also on the list, so I need a tip for Belmont for this weekend from you. What have you got for us?
Right, well, that was Rob Humphreys who wanted the tips for the last at Belmont, and I haven't looked at a form guide for probably 2 years in Australia. So I looked at the form guide last night, and it's like they rustled up every nag in WA who's only ever run 4th to 10th, and then they put them in the last at Belmont this weekend.
Right.
So first of all, I'd be hard pressed to pick a winner in there. I mean, someone's got to get first across the line. I'll go On Patrol.
On Patrol.
On Patrol.
All right, there you go. That's the winner this weekend.
Maybe.
God, I hope you're right. A couple of quick questions from the floor, thanks to those who've submitted some. With WA slipping in the Fraser rankings, do you see our competitiveness being restored more through policy reform or through partnerships like AUKUS?
No, it won't be through AUKUS.
No?
No, you're going to have to do it through policy reform. That's where your red tape is. You've got to fix that.
Yeah, okay. The difference in time for approvals in Australia compared to somewhere like the US or Canada or even Africa?
Well, let's face it, this is why the US has got a critical mineral supply shortage, is that they collapsed their mines department 20 odd years ago and put it inside the environmental department. So there is no mines department in the US, and I don't think there's been a mine developed in the US for 30 odd years. They're going to have to get those resources from outside the country. I think that, this is going to be a challenge for numerous countries moving ahead, is compressing those development timelines for people. Okay.
The railway line that you showed us at the start here, Bronwyn, the maintenance of that, will that fall under your responsibility, Ivanhoe that is, if you are the major user of that track?
No. What's happening is the Liberian government is forming the National Railway Authority. The National Railway Authority then governs all the users on the line. There's a user operator fee that gets charged, as well as a per tonne fee, and that fee goes into the National Railway Authority, and the National Railway Authority is then responsible for appointing the independent operator, and the independent operator does the maintenance of the track.
Okay. I think it's got one more. There's been talk about the IPO coming.
Yes.
For Ivanhoe Atlantic.
Yes.
How far off are we with that?
Look, I've pushed that back a little bit. We were waiting to get the ratification through of the Rail and Port Access Agreement. I'd like to see that ratified through Parliament before we launch the IPO, but not far away.
Okay. Months?
I'd like to launch it by December, but don't hold me to it.
Okay, we'd never do that.
No, well, I'm private company, so I can say what I like.
There was a bunch more questions in there. True. Apologies to those who submitted a question we didn't have time to get through, but I'm sure Bronwyn will be here for a bit. So if you still desperately want an answer, come and find Bronwyn at table 6. But thank you very much for your time and your thoughts this afternoon. It feels like we just scratched the surface with you and your incredible career. So thank you for sharing your insights with us this afternoon. And I'll hand over to Jordan for a more formal vote of thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn. You're an absolute weapon. That was incredible. We really want to hear more about your journey. I feel today I'm absolutely petrified of heights, so I need to go sign up for a skydiving class or something to better that professional development. But thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for being here.